Hello, I'm Kate Gerbeau. Welcome to Sitrep, your weekly look at the big issues in defence and world affairs. NATO leaders have a lot to talk about when they meet in Washington in 5 weeks' time.
We need to do more to strengthen our deterrence and defence. We have agreed new defence plans, and what we have to do in Washington is to demonstrate that we are delivering on those plans.
But are these high-profile gatherings of presidents and prime ministers just a talking shop full of hollow words? Or can they make a real difference to our defence and armed forces? We'll hear from someone who's been in the room for many a NATO summit. The French president is the latest leader to say Ukraine should be allowed to fire Western-supplied missiles into Russia. So we assess where they might want to strike and how much difference it could make.
The idea is to sort of cut the head off the Russian snake in Russia so that the front line loses its command and control, loses its logistics, its ammunition, really putting everything back in the favour of the Ukrainians.
And 80 years on from D-Day, what are your favourite books and films telling its story?
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Mike, hi. Been an interesting week for you, hasn't it? Hobnobbing with one of the US's top retired generals at the Hay Literary Festival. Tell me about it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, David Petraeus. Yeah, I was at a meeting before the festival, a meeting about the future of the army, and somebody said, just in passing, they said, we don't have the warrior monk like Petraeus in the British Army. And I thought, warrior monk, I'll offer him that one, see if he likes that, which he did. And yes, he was talking, I was in conversation with him, talking about his book with Andrew Roberts on the future of conflict. And it's a book about conflict since 1945, a series of essays on just about every conflict. It's not a military history. They are discussive essays. And what runs through them is where the strategy worked and where it didn't. And so it's really about David Petraeus' idea about strategy, that you've got to have the big idea right. You've got to get that right. You've got to communicate the big idea. You've got to implement it, which sounds easy if you say it quickly. And then you've got to feed back the way in which it is working to adjust it as time goes on. All of that sounds obvious, but it's surprising how hard it is to do in the conditions of conflict. So that's really what the book is about, and it's a good starting point for a discussion about future strategies that we might all be facing in the next 10 years or so.
And Mike, you were in the interviewer's seat for this job, weren't you? You were asking him the questions in front of an audience, I understand. I mean, how did it all go down? Was there a lot of interest in it?
Oh yes, we were packed out in the it's all tents, and in the tent that we were in called the Hat, it was packed out, people standing at the back, and it went very well. I mean, it was very interesting, and you could tell just by the silence in the room. You know, sometimes you hear silence because people are listening so carefully and so intently. And you know, David Petraeus is a very good communicator. That's why he's such a good strategist, because he does have the big ideas, right or wrongly, and he communicates them pretty well. And so it was a very vibrant session. And of course, he went then straight off to sign multiple copies of his book in the Waterstones tent. Other bookstores are available, but this is the Waterstones tent.
And other interviews as well, Mike, because we did an interview for Sitrep with David Petraeus and Andrew Roberts. That's in an extra edition of Sitrep, the podcast. It's about conflict, the evolution of war, the book you mentioned. We'll have some more book talk and films a bit later as we look ahead to the 80th anniversary of D-Day. But let's look ahead just a little further to the 9th of July, when NATO leaders will gather for a summit in Washington. The Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has set out his 3 priorities for the meeting: making decisions on deterrence and defence, a more robust foundation for supporting Ukraine, and global partnerships, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. Before we talk through that summit content, we thought it would be useful to first understand how these summits actually work. Lord Peter Ricketts can give us the inside track from his 42-year government career, which included 3 years as the UK's ambassador to NATO, 4 years in charge of the Foreign Office, and 2 years as the UK's first national security advisors. And he joins us now. Lord Ricketts, great to have you on Sitrep. I'm guessing you've been to a lot of NATO summits over the years.
Yes, I have, Kate. And the way to think about them, I think, is contrast with the EU. For an EU summit, which is dealing with all kinds of highly technical issues which get immediate impact in the legislation of member states, The only way that the EU has found over the years to reach agreement is to literally lock all the leaders on their own in a room around one table and not let them out till they've agreed. And so an EU summit has the leaders only, no officials, one or two council secretariat people, perhaps 30, 35 people in the room. A NATO summit is completely different because each head of state and government is accompanied by their chief of defence staff, defence secretary, foreign secretary, ambassador, and various officials, loads of people from the NATO civil and military secretariats, probably 300 people or more in the room. So they are not a forum at the summit for any kind of negotiation.
Generally, they're very carefully choreographed in front of the cameras. What is it actually like behind the scenes?
Yes, and a US president does not want to negotiate text. So what happens is that for weeks beforehand, a committee of the deputy ambassadors meets to thrash out a long, detailed text, 60, 70 paragraphs often, covering both the immediate issues that you talked about there and every other point that NATO is interested in. That gets refined. Foreign ministers are actually meeting in the next couple of days in Prague to take that further. And by the time it gets to the summit, that text is pretty well cooked. There are probably 2 or 3 issues in it which are really difficult and political, which are left for leaders to sort out in little huddles around the room. So that's basically the process for the official content. But the real value of these summits, of course, is as a forcing event, obliging everyone to reach agreement, even on issues where there are differences, and then all the margins opportunities where leaders have coffees and teas and late night drinks together and can sort out some of the most tricky problems like that.
And Mike, you've been to NATO summits too. What's your experience of them? Do you get any access to the real action?
No, not really, and that's as it should be. In a way, I think we have to realise that NATO summits are also a sort of an alliance jamboree, and I get involved, or have been involved, as one of the cheerleaders in parts of the jamboree. So I've been involved as one of the organisers of a sort of NGO assembly that accompanies it, or youth assemblies, and sometimes in the press room. I remember in 2014 in Wales, the press room was a different building altogether on a different part of the site because it was on a big golfing estate. And the idea in the press room is that that NATO's got to keep the press occupied, otherwise they get up to mischief. Mm-hmm. So every now and again somebody will come in, one of the principals will come in and do a press conference and answer questions, and in between those things then people like me get up and talk about the state of European security or whatever it is, and act as a sort of friend to NATO to fill this programme of events. And so the press are there for 2 days and they have to be kept busy, otherwise they'll get up to all sorts of things which will be unhelpful. So my involvement has always been as a sort of a jamboree organiser away from the principals, and that's a useful role, I think.
Indeed. Peter, each country will have their most senior military officers present as part of the delegation, alongside top civil servants and, of course, the political leaders. How much part do those officers actually play in the work of the summit?
Well, NATO has a military committee made up of the chiefs of defence staff who meet from time to time, and they would certainly be meeting ahead of the summit to feed in to governments what their priorities are. The chairman of the military committee, of course, will be sitting around the table with the heads of state and government. But this is essentially a civilian-led process. I mean, the drafting and the choice of priorities is done in the governments, listening to the advice of the military people, but they're not in the front seat here. They're in a second row seat, ready to prompt their leaders or answer questions if they come up during the summit. But essentially, this is the civilian governments setting the strategy and the direction with advice from the military folk.
And when we see video of all the leaders sitting in a giant circle at the start of that summit meeting, what happens once the doors have closed?
Well, it's extremely boring. I mean, once the main speakers have had their say, the American president, the French president, let's hope the British Prime Minister and one or two others, then you get endless droning on of heads of government all day and well into the evening sometimes. And so people start peeling off. They leave their ambassador in the chair while they go off and have bilaterals. They have little huddles. They advance business outside the room. So what happens in the room is the sort of formal ceremonial part of a NATO summit, if you like, all pre-scripted. And then what happens off the stage, round the back, sorting out difficulties, strong-arming people who may have objections to one or other point in the summit communique, That's where the real action is. So, yeah, you try not to stay in the room longer than you can if you're a leader.
Yeah, you want to get outside and see the Jamboree leader, Michael Clarke, don't you?
Well, you want to go and talk to the press tent, exactly. And of course, if there is something to announce, then you can be killed in the stampede as leaders rush out to try and get to the podium first to announce that they've had a great success on whatever point it is.
And Peter, you talked about most of the work being done beforehand, ready for the leaders to rubber stamp. It doesn't always go to plan, though, does it? Particularly if you think of the 2018 summit when Donald Trump ripped up the rule book.
Yeah, and that was pretty much unprecedented, I think. Normally these things are on train tracks and they go through to a pre-choreographed conclusion. Of course, Trump doesn't play by those rules. And as you say, he tore the whole thing up. And then when they did finally get to agree something, I think he went straight out afterward and said he didn't agree with it. So that is a chaotic way of proceeding. And that's why I'm sure there's quite a sort of discernible cloud over the Washington NATO summit, the 75th birthday summit for the alliance, that it is not impossible that they might have Mr. Trump back around the table in 2025.
And Mike, let's come to the content for this summit then. Big picture, how important is this one and what it does or doesn't decide?
Yes, I mean, the 75th anniversary is a pretty delicate time. I think it's probably the most delicate since 1949 in terms of global security concerns and European security concerns. I think in sort of I would say three things in descending order of publicity, as it were. What will attract a lot of attention, I'm sure, is spending. What are the commitments to spending on defence among the NATO members? That's what a lot of people will focus on, and certainly Americans will focus on. And then behind that is a more complex issue of readiness. What about the military readiness of this alliance and what it's got and what it can put into place for genuine deterrence of a conventional war in Europe? It makes lots of statements. It's getting there, but not fast enough. And then behind that again, which people don't really want to talk about, is the increasing difference, it seems to me, between the northern agenda and the southern agenda within NATO. At 32 countries, NATO is a very big alliance. And that difference between what is intrinsic to the northern members and what is intrinsically important to the southern members, I don't think has ever been so great. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine kind of papers over that. But as we go into the third year of the Ukraine war, that difference in agenda begins to surface in ways that affect NATO's reaction to Ukraine. And so I think that will be the third level, the sort of informal soundings out that Peter was talking about, I think will be very much on those issues.
And what do you think, Peter, about the importance of what is and isn't decided?
Well, I think there's one other big issue that Mike hasn't mentioned, which is Ukraine. The Vilnius summit last year was defined by Zelensky being extremely angry that he didn't get a formal invitation to start the process of Ukraine accession to NATO. And he's not going to get one at Washington either. I think it's pretty clear that a number of allies aren't yet ready to formally invite Ukraine to start the process. And so I think the public outcome of the summit, how the press tent reacts to it, will be very much determined by whether Zelensky accepts that and makes the best of it and comes out saying, nonetheless, it was a real success for Ukraine, or once again gets angry and says this is disgraceful, that I deserve better with Ukrainians fighting and dying. I think Stoltenberg and the other leaders will be scrambling to produce whatever they can to show that NATO remains deadly serious about supporting Ukraine. Stoltenberg wants to move the arms supply and the training activities more onto a NATO-organized footing than the rather more sort of informal approach up to now. You could see that also as Trump-proofing things. In case President Trump arrived next year, NATO would be more in charge of how training and support for Ukraine was organized than it is now. And there'll be, I'm sure, lots of reassurance that NATO is determined to continue supporting Ukraine. But the headline outcome that Zelensky has been so hoping for of an invitation to start the accession negotiations isn't going to happen. And that's going to be the public relations presentation issue for the summit.
Mike, on those specifics, deterrence and defence, protecting NATO countries, essentially the Secretary-General saying they need to demonstrate they're delivering already agreed plans for more forces and higher readiness with new capabilities. What are those plans exactly and how far away is NATO from turning them into reality?
Depends on the area we're talking about. So NATO's got plenty of combat aircraft, but not enough air defence, for instance, not enough ballistic missile defence. There's a lot of talk about the Poland and the Baltics and the Scandinavian states creating bigger barriers on their mutual borders with Russia where they occur, and there's a lot of discussion about that. And then making a reality of all of the battle group concepts that were arrived at some years ago now, the doubling of the number of battle groups at high readiness in NATO. That's got to be converted into brigade and divisional size units that can be mobilized very, very quickly. And then I think there'll be a lot of discussion just on numbers, on conscription, on national service, on mobilization numbers and speed of mobilization. So those are the sorts of things which I think the military specialists will try to get into. Not that NATO can create any of these things, but NATO can try to, as it were, coordinate and harmonise the national plans that all of its members are making and urge them to make more plans and more harmoniously with each other. That's really what NATO's role is.
And Peter, how hard a job has the Secretary-General got in ensuring commitments to stronger forces don't end up just hollow words?
The Secretary-General has a huge role in sort of thought leadership in the alliance and encouragement and constant travelling and badgering and encouraging governments to live up to the fine words that they sign up to at the NATO summit. And I think Jens Stoltenberg has done an excellent job. And I say that in the past tense because, of course, the last thing that this summit has to do is to select the new Secretary-General. He's been extended several times. Stoltenberg is clearly now going to be leaving by the end of the year in the middle of this European-wide war in Ukraine. And it looks like the lead candidate is Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands. But the summit will need to consecrate Mark Rutte and give him the job of leading, encouraging, pushing, badgering governments to live up to the undertakings they've made.
And Mike, what kind of leadership do you think we'd get from Mark Rutte if he's confirmed?
Yes, I think he will be confirmed because there's no sensible alternative, and we spent a year talking about the possible candidates, so I'm fairly sure it will be him. It'd be a major upset if it isn't, and I think he'll bring all his coalition building skills with him. He's the coalition in the Netherlands has just now selected a prime minister, so in stepping down, he's now leaving the Netherlands with a government led by a proper prime minister. And he, I think, will bring this sort of continuity from Stoltenberg. He takes a tough view against Russia over the Ukraine war. He is good at dealing with different people. He's very good at dealing with the United States. He's got a good reputation around the bazaars of Washington. So I think I have great hopes of Mark Rutte as an effective NATO Sec-Gen. But my goodness, he's going to have his work cut out for him in the next couple of years.
OK, let's just look at Ukraine and what the outgoing Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said in a speech a few days ago.
The problem is that over the last months, we have not delivered to Ukraine what we promised. The United States spent 6 months agreeing a new package of aid. European allies that promised 1 million rounds of ammunition have not delivered anything close to that number of rounds of ammunition to Ukraine. Except for Germany, that has delivered one additional system of Patriots, allies have not delivered what they promised on air defense.
Now, by Jens Stoltenberg's generally very diplomatic standards, that sounds to me like he's going to be reading the riot act to presidents and prime ministers on this, Peter.
Yes, and there he is in his role of being the encourager-in-chief of the alliance. He's clearly angry at the months of delay it took the Americans to get their $60 billion over the line and start delivering the weapons. I think we can see on the battlefield that Ukraine has been pushed back in those months because their forces didn't have the munitions, the missiles, the air defense they needed to withstand the Russian attack. Now that is beginning to flow again, but there's been a real gap. And the Europeans are not coming through with the scale of weapons deliveries, missiles, ammunition that they promised. this is part of the long-term problem, that we've not geared up our economies to the sort of war footing that Putin has done, and that is now showing up in shortages on the front line for the Ukrainians. And so that is a very important role for the NATO Secretary General. It's a very important role for the summit because all the leaders are there and they can hear the dramatic comments from the Secretary General, from the alliance military leadership, that they really have got to go further and faster in keeping Ukraine supplied.
Now, the Secretary General wants leaders to agree a much bigger role for NATO itself to coordinate and provide security assistance and training to Ukraine. Good or bad idea, Mike?
Well, when national initiatives are put into a multinational framework, there's an upside and a downside. I mean, the downside is often that it slows things down and bureaucratizes them a bit. But the upside is that it locks in a commitment and it allows for, as it were, pushing everybody and preventing backsliding. So in general, in this case, I would say the upside is better than the downside. And I think it's probably a good idea.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it will bring more coordination and coherence to the way things are done. Of course, the material has to come from the member states.
Indeed. Mike, stay with us. Lord Ricketts, thanks very much for your time. Well, let's talk more about Ukraine now. Last week, we discussed the idea and politics of giving Kyiv greater freedom to use Western weapons to strike Russia on its own soil. This week, amid growing political chatter, we want to focus on how that might actually work on the ground and what difference it can or cannot make. A Ukrainian commander has just written a plea to President Biden titled, "Please Untie Our Hands," in the Washington Post, saying his forces are paralyzed because US policy dictates we are not allowed to use American munitions on Russian territory. Well, that's despite what the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said in Kyiv just a couple of weeks ago.
We have not encouraged or enabled strikes outside of Ukraine, but ultimately Ukraine has to make decisions for itself about how it's going to conduct this war. A war it's conducting in defense of its freedom, of its sovereignty, of its territorial integrity.
Well, let's bring in Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, the Army's former Assistant Director of Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance. Hamish, good to have you on the programme. What Antony Blinken says there, does that sound to you like a green light to Ukraine to strike sovereign Russian territory with US-supplied missiles?
Well, let's hope that it is, because, for the last 2 years, Ukraine has sort of been fighting this war with at least one hand tied behind its back. On the one side, Russia is on a total war footing, is throwing everything at Ukraine, firing missiles, hypersonic missiles, the latest stuff they have, from way inside Russian territory. And the fact that for the last 2 years, they haven't been able to use some of the smarter, longer range weapons to take out these Russian military capability is been really difficult. So if, as hopefully the Americans and the Brits and others are going to allow the Ukrainians to use precision-guided missiles, the long-range ATACMS, the HIMARS and the Storm Shadow to take out some of these strategic targets, that to me is a very significant move. And there is not a moment to lose. Let's hope the Americans do mean attack targets in Russia, so that Ukraine can get on with it. And things are in the balance at the moment, and this might well tip the balance back into Ukraine's favour.
And those ATACMS missiles supplied by the US have a range of around 200 miles. Given the battlefield layout as it is at the moment, how far into Russian territory could they actually reach?
Well, that's a really good question. Certainly the ATACMS, as you say, we're even if they're close to the border, they're a couple of 100 miles in. Some of the longer range capabilities, like the Storm Shadow, a little bit further. So, it's not a huge distance. However, a lot of the key airfields are probably within range. And also, Ukraine has long range drones as well, which can be fitted with sophisticated equipment to extend the range. But it's that 200-mile sort of buffer from the Ukraine border where a lot of the Russian buildup is happening. We're hearing about huge troop buildups in the northeast near Kharkiv at the moment. The airfields are there. So I think they are pretty much in range. And if the shackles are taken off, I'm sure Ukraine can make a huge difference. Also, the other area, and I think very much Putin's prize, is the Kerch Bridge. Now, for a morale perspective for the Ukrainians, if they could shut that bridge, it would be hugely significant. And for Putin, if his sort of prize pet project is denied, something strategic like the Kerch Bridge being shut, again, might start turning the public opinion against the Kremlin.
So are those the prime targets you're talking about, the Kerch Bridge and airfields inside Russia itself? Anything else? And what extent are we talking about in terms of numbers of airfields?
Well, I think added to that are the supply lines, the communication routes, the railways, the main roads, and also areas of build-up of troops, and the command and control where the generals are sitting directing these operations. It's been pretty clear hitherto that actually the Ukrainians are getting a lot of really good intelligence. In other words, they're getting very detailed sort of grid references, if you like, where these places are, so that if they're allowed to use the weapons, they will have the other part of it, the technology. As far as the numbers go, there are, we don't know exactly, but there are 3 or 4 large airfields where a lot of activity is focused on a lot of the aircraft. We know in Crimea that some of those key airfields have already been hit pretty hard. A lot of those aircraft have gone. We also know with the Crimea that the Ukrainians have hit the Black Sea Fleet. In fact, the Black Sea Fleet no longer exists. And that is important because that gives Ukraine freedom of maneuver in the Black Sea. These attacks deep into Russia should allow Ukrainian land forces to have freedom of maneuver to start getting on the front foot rather than purely in defence, which they've been for the last year or so.
And when you mention that range of targets, it would be a real balancing act for Ukraine, wouldn't it? Because it's a finite supply of precision missiles. Are they best used strategically against static targets like the air bases, or held for use more tactically against those resupply convoys, for example? What would your thinking be if it was the decision was in your hands?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good question. These are not limitless, and we're talking about missiles that cost, millions of dollars. And there is a certain supply of them. It is much easier to hit static targets. I'm sure the Ukrainian teams will have what we call a target list, those high prize targets, and they'll work out which ones they are most likely to be able to hit and have an impact on them and go to them first. And I think also the strategic sort of command and control hubs, if they know where they are, they'll hit them. The idea is to sort of cut the head off the Russian snake in Russia so that the front line loses its command and control, loses its logistics, its ammunition. We know the Russians are firing 5 artillery rounds for every 1 Ukrainian. If we can redress that balance, really putting everything back in the favour of the Ukrainians. I think the absolute key thing here is as things stand at the moment, this might well tip the balance in Ukraine's favour. As we've heard President Macron of France and others talking about, NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. If this fails, that is the sort of next step, and we get closer and closer to a war in Europe, which we need to avoid at all costs. So this might well make the difference.
And Hamish, James Heapy told us last week that the UK never imposed restrictions on the use of Storm Shadow missiles. Those have a greater range than ATACMS. Why do you think we haven't seen those used for more significant strategic strikes in Russia?
Well, again, that is a good question. I think there are a lot of strikes that have happened in Russia that have not been directly identified to a particular weapon. So I think a lot of those key strikes in Russia probably have been the British Storm Shadow missiles. But again, they're in short supply. They don't have a huge amount of them. And it's a balancing act of working out, what is the most valuable targets to hit and what are the likely ones that are going to make a difference. But yeah, I think Britain has led the way here. But of course, it's the Americans who can really tip the balance. They are by far and away the biggest provider of military capability and sophisticated missiles. And if they give the green light, that shows a really significant message to the Ukrainians and to the Russians.
A significant message. And how much of a difference do you think it could make in the balance of the war?
Well, I think at the moment, it could tip the balance back in the favour of Ukraine. Everybody's been seeing what's happening around Kharkiv and some of the advances on the front line. So that is the key thing to put a hold on Russia. Russia at the moment is relying on massive manpower, massive weapons, massive artillery to try and advance. We have been providing the Ukrainians with technology. Technology only sort of goes so far. We're learning from Ukraine that mass is really important and very important for the British Army. Discussion for another day. So I think this does have the potential. If the Russians now know that nothing is safe within, say, 200 miles of the Ukrainian border, that will give them a lot of really difficult decisions to make. And on the battlefield, you want to give your enemy a lot of decisions, a lot of difficult decisions, because that is when they start making mistakes. So the opening up that area of Russia to attacks from Ukraine, I think, could be hugely significant.
And your analysis on the Forces News website, in that you also relate this issue to possible Russian anti-satellite weapons in space. Just explain a bit more for us about that.
Well, this was another announcement last week coming out of the US that they believe that Russia had launched anti-satellite satellites. We get from that these are Russian satellites that have the ability to take down other satellites, presumably US and UK and NATO intelligence satellites, which no doubt are hoovering up an awful lot of intelligence. Now, whether this is a reality or not, who knows? There is so much bluff and bluster in this campaign, so much propaganda and disinformation. But one can see why Russia would like to blind those satellites that are presumably giving the Ukrainians the advantage by the detailed location of Russian positions. So, I think this is another part to it, as are the nuclear threats, which I know you guys have discussed in detail, which again is making particularly the nuclear threats, making leaders in Europe think twice and make to them difficult decisions. So it's all part of this complex environment. I don't think we should take one of these things too seriously, but we should note it. And I think the Russians are really trying to deflect, because going back to our original question, if Ukraine can attack deep into Russia, that completely changes the metric and the thinking for the Russian military, and they want to deflect it. If I think they're suggesting, well, if you do that, we might try and take out some of your satellites. Whether they can do that, who knows? Similarly, whether the Americans can do it, I expect that is equally as likely.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thanks for your time. Good to speak to you.
Pleasure.
Mike, where and what do you think will be top of that target list that Hamish mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, it's not difficult to work it out from Ukraine's point of view. They're quite happy to hit anything in the Donbass or Crimea or southern Zaporizhia, because that's Ukrainian territory. Although the Russians claim it, they've got no basis for that claim other than conquest. So hitting anything there is absolutely fine by the Western allies. But military targets in Western Russia, the two big sorts of targets are troop concentrations and armor concentrations, which we can see now as we speak taking place opposite the cities of Sumy and Chernihiv on the Russian side of the border. They're building up this stuff, and it's extremely vulnerable. If the Ukrainians were allowed to target it, they would actually do a great deal of damage to those concentrations, and the Russians wouldn't be able to concentrate. That's one thing. And the second thing is to do something about these glide bombs, the FAB 500 and the FAB 1000. They're doing terrible damage to Ukraine, and it's very hard to stop them, because the only way to stop these glide bombs is to get to the aircraft that are dropping them or releasing them from 30,000 feet, very often over Russian territory or only just over the border, or the bases inside Western Russia from where the bombers take off. And so that's the other big target. If the Ukrainians could somehow push those bombers releasing the Fab 500 and the Fab 1000s away from the front lines, sufficiently far away, about 30 or 40 miles away, that would give them huge relief from the weapon that is at the moment doing them the greatest damage.
It's all a hypothetical if Ukraine is barred from firing certain weapons into Russia. The public music from Western leaders seems to be saying go ahead. But the Ukrainians say the US is still holding out. What is actually going on?
Yeah, it's within the administration, I think. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, he is very concerned about escalation. And when Joe Biden, gets advice, Jake Sullivan always warns him, and Biden leans towards the caution of Jake Sullivan. Whereas Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he's gone the other way in a sense. I mean, he seems to have come round to the view that the Ukrainians can only fight this war by being allowed to use the weapons in the way they think best. And so clearly there's an argument going on in the administration. It's also going on in Congress. And funnily enough, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who came over to the Ukrainian side of the argument, away from some of the MAGA Republicans, he now says that the Ukrainians ought to be allowed to strike where they think, because his view, and it's a very respectable view, is that the skepticism about American aid to Ukraine is on the basis that, well, don't give them, we shouldn't give them aid if they can't use it properly. Why give them aid if it won't make a difference? But if it'll make a difference, then there's an argument for doing it. And if the aid is to make a difference, then the Ukrainians have got to be able to use it as they think best. And so this is a very vibrant argument at the moment within the administration and in Congress. Very interesting and critical to the future of the war for Ukraine.
And all the while, the clock keeps on ticking, doesn't it? Well, as promised, let's talk books again and films. As we approach the 80th anniversary, we've been asking online what your favourite D-Day related books and films are. There are three that come up again and again. Saving Private Ryan, the related TV series Band of Brothers, and The Longest Day, a non-fiction book published in 1959, then turned into a docudrama film in 1962.
Any minute now, stand by! Let's give it them back for Dunkirk! Keep those vehicles moving! MP, chase up those cyclists! Never mind the blathering. We've got to put these things down somewhere. The sooner you people get off the beach, the sooner they'll stop this blasted shelling. It's very bad for the dog.
Oh, Mike, it sounds quite quaint now, doesn't it? Clearly people still love it, though.
Oh, yeah. That was Kenneth More. He was actually playing a man called Captain Colin Maud, who died only in 1980. And Colin Maud, he did, like Kenneth More in the film, he had a big beard. He had a dog called Winston, although it wasn't a bulldog. It was actually a German Shepherd dog. And he carried a shillelagh. And Colin Maud was an advisor to the film when the film was made in 1962. And he gave Kenneth More the actual shillelagh that he used on D-Day. And he strode around the beach, hitting vehicles with his shillelagh. That's what Kenneth More did. There was a degree of accuracy in that. And, there was another, he was on Juno, which was the other British beach. The big British beach was at Sword. And one of the beachmasters at Sword was a man called Teddy Gerritts, Lieutenant Commander Teddy Gerritts. And he lasted 19 days before he was badly wounded. And Teddy Gerritts also went around in very bright helmet, a big red scarf so people could see who he was. And he wore colourful things, carried a walking stick, and he recovered from his wound. And he then, in later years, became director of RUSI.
Oh, wow.
And he was one of my predecessors at RUSI, yeah. Lieutenant Commander Teddy Gerritts was again, one of these eccentric beachmasters on Sword Beach, just getting everything moving. And the beachmasters recorded, they said within a few hours, they had MPs acting as traffic policemen. Literally with the white gloves on and the white helmet, directing traffic as if they were standing in the middle of Piccadilly Circus, because it was important to get everything moved off the beach as quickly as possible, which they did.
And Mike, those other two I mentioned, Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan, are both based on factual writings by the American historian Stephen Ambrose. Do you rate them?
Yes, yeah, I do. Saving Private Ryan is a good film. It becomes a sort of more conventional war film after a while. But the landing on Omaha Beach is that first 20 minutes of the film. Spielberg director is very, very powerful, and it does give a sense of just how dangerous this whole thing was. They had real problems at Omaha, and it became a death trap. And the Band of Brothers is also very important. I mean, that's, it's about Easy Company, the 506th of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles. And, I was only reading something about a month ago about that, because the Airborne, the 25,000 troops of the Airborne who were going to drop behind the beaches on that midnight of 6th of June, it was hugely dangerous. And it was expected that they might suffer up to 75% casualties. Now, in the event, they only suffered about 8% casualties, but at the time, it was thought they would suffer up to 75%. And Eisenhower, when he'd given the order to go at 4:30 in the morning on the 5th of June, he spent the rest of the morning doing things he had to do. And then in the early evening, he went to Greenham Common, where the 101st were leaving from, the Band of Brothers characters. And he went and he spoke to some of the boys before they embarked. And there's lots of photographs of him standing informally, surrounded by troopers. They've all got their gear on. They've got their faces blackened. And a few years ago, a lady who was a WAF, who was serving tea and coffee and donuts to the lads, she went to Eisenhower. She gave him a cup of coffee. And he couldn't drink it because his hands were shaking so much. Oh. And she sort of went to him and gradually, just gently took it off him. And he watched the 1st Dakota leave. And then he got into his car, and Case Summersby was his driver, his British Army driver. And he got into the car, sat in the back, and he said, "Well, it's on." And she looked in the mirror, and he was weeping because he thought that he'd been talking to some of the lads he might well be sending to their death. Now, in the event, only less than 10% of them were killed. But the risks that the Airborne in particular were taking were quite remarkable. And Band of Brothers captures that, I think, very, very well.
Such incredible bravery. Several history books rather than dramatisations got mentioned. Invasion 44 by John Frayne Turner, Overlord by Max Hastings, and D-Day, The Battle for Normandy by Anthony Beevor. What do you think of those?
Yeah, very good. Overlord, Max Hastings' book, was one of the first I read that really got the whole thing moving nicely. And Turner's book is also good. And Anthony Beevor's book, of course, he looks at the whole Battle for Normandy. But I'd also recommend, if people are thinking about that, just D-Day itself, Peter Caddick-Adams, very good military historian. His book from 4 or 5 years ago, I think, called Sand and Steel. And that gives so much detail, personal detail and technical detail, of the actual day itself, the day of D-Day. It doesn't say very much about the Battle for Normandy, which goes on for a couple of months afterwards, but the preparations for and this dramatic day of days of the 6th of June, it's very, very good on that.
Plenty of reading and rereading to do. Mike, thanks so much, and thanks to all of our guests. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday when we talk more about D-Day and some of history's other great military deceptions, including one that has been turned into a musical. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.